My name is Declan Waugh. I'm an Irish environmental scientist based in County Cork. I've been working as a scientist for about 25 years and have spent the last 3 years literally working full-time doing due diligence and risk assessment on the health and environmental impacts of water fluoridation on public's health and on the environment. And I would have, at this stage, devoted well over 10,000 hours of research, examining all of the published literature literally that has been published on the subject over the last 50 years. And I'm here to tell you something about it today.
Can I ask you, Declan, about the differences in terms of disease rates between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland, and in terms of cancer, depression, and arthritis? Can I ask you about that? Because a lot of people are very interested in it.
I'm going to be addressing 4 published All-Ireland studies today in my presentation, and they're absolutely astounding. They're absolutely astounding. The first, or 2 of them, are dealing with the differences in cancer rates between the north and south. Reports were published by the cancer research registers of both Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland, and they're unbelievable. I mean, the report in 2009 looking at cancer differences between the north and south of Ireland, the first thing they state in the report is that because we're a small island community, the differences should not be significant because the populations are the same and the diets are the same. And then they go on in their report and they show that the incidences of brain cancer, ovarian cancer, of leukemia, of cancers of the central nervous system, of every known cancer literally are higher in the south of Ireland than in Northern Ireland. Liver cancers, kidney cancers, every one you could possibly imagine. But what is astonishing in the report is that they identify the fact that there has been no increase in incidence of cancer in Northern Ireland during the reporting period, and in the south of Ireland the increases are increasing in some cases at 3% per annum. So we have now a situation where, say, chronic lymphoblastic leukemia in Ireland, in 2002 they said the rates in the south of Ireland were up to 60% higher than in Northern Ireland. So brain cancers are 20% higher for women in the south of Ireland than in Northern Ireland. Prostate cancer is 29% higher in the south of Ireland than in Northern Ireland. Researchers from Japan published a paper in 2002 in the Journal of Epidemiology where they identified, when they looked at 35 leading cancers in the United States and looked at water fluoridation, and they did regression analysis in terms of mathematical modelling of health records, they found that water fluoridation was associated with 63% of cancers. And the same cancers that they identified in that report are the ones that are higher in the south of Ireland than in Northern Ireland. Our Irish Cancer Registry have said that there's no evidence anywhere in the world to show that water fluoridation is associated with cancer. Yet this peer-reviewed published paper, published in 2001, 2002 in the Journal of Epidemiology, identified clearly through mathematical statistical modelling that water fluoridation had an association with increased cancer risk, and the same cancers that they identified are significantly higher in the south of Ireland than in Northern Ireland.
Are there any counties in Ireland that are particularly high in fluoride and maybe have more cancer rates than in the Republic, that is, than other counties?
A few locations in Ireland where you would have naturally occurring elevated levels of fluoride in the drinking water supply, if they're getting it from groundwater. You won't find fluoride elevated in surface waters, but you will find it elevated in groundwaters depending on the geology. So in areas where you would have basalt rock, where you would have limestone, any area like that, there's a possibility that you would have elevated levels of fluoride. So they've identified places in Tipperary and in Meath and in other parts of the country where the level of fluoride is well above 1 milligrams per litre. They've never done any assessment as to what are the potential health effects in those areas. What I found in my interpretation of the data is that the areas that are most at risk are the ones that would have extremely soft water that is artificially fluoridated. So if you look at West Cork, for example, the calcium level in the drinking water supply in West Cork is 15 milligrams per litre. In other parts of Ireland it's 300 milligrams per litre. So fluoride binds to calcium, so the lower amount of calcium you have in the water supply, the more bioavailable fluoride you have that will increase fluoride levels in your plasma. So you have higher levels of fluoride circulating in your blood. The areas that have the highest rates of depression and cancer in Ireland are the areas that have the lowest calcium level in their water supply. They also happen to be fluoridated. So, like, the cancer rate in Cork is exceptionally high. The rates of other diseases are exceptionally high in West Cork. And nobody's looking at the toxicity of hexafluoric acid with regards to soft water or extremely soft water and hard water. And that is why, for instance, New Zealand has such an astonishing rate of asthma and other metabolic and endocrine disorders, because the drinking water in New Zealand generally has a calcium level of less than 10. So Auckland and Wellington and these cities have extremely soft water. It's almost like deionized water in many respects. So when you introduce fluoride into that water supply, the effects are more pronounced in that population. That's why you had a 15-fold increase in asthma rates in New Zealand after they started fluoridation. And it's the same in Ireland. So some people, if they live in an area with harder water, that's actually a benefit to them, because it acts as a buffer to fluoride toxicity.
Can you tell me about any studies you've seen, fluoride was taken out of the tap water, and what the effects were after it was taken out in terms of health of the lake?
Well, I'll start with in terms of locations that have stopped fluoridation of water supply. The most recent data I've got under the Freedom of Information Act is coming from New Zealand. I've asked people in New Zealand to go to the health authorities and provide data or get access to data on hospital admission rates for children for asthma under the age of 5 and under the age of 15, because fluoride is directly associated with pulmonary toxicity, and all of the increases in asthma that have occurred over the world, the major increases have occurred only in the fluoridated countries. And the highest rates of asthma in the world are only found in fluoridated countries. So Ireland has about 5 times the rate of asthma in other European nations, even though we have the cleanest air. And that increase has only occurred since fluoridation occurred. It wasn't there in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. And it's the same in New Zealand. The incidence of asthma in New Zealand in 1960 before they fluoridated was 1%, and it's now 35%. So there's been a number of local authorities in New Zealand that have stopped fluoridating, and the most recent was in New Plymouth, and the health records from New Plymouth showed a 60% reduction in hospital admissions for asthma the year after they stopped fluoridation in 2011. And the data I was looking at last night with regards to today's presentation looks at paediatric admissions for asthma in Ireland from 2000 to 2011 in a research project that was funded by the HSE. It's astonishing, really, because in it they show a graph of a constant level of unchanged with regards to high levels of paediatric admission for asthma for children, and then suddenly in 2007 it drops, and it has remained at a lower level since 2007. And this entire group of pediatricians and public health officials were asking the question, what caused the drop in 2007, and they couldn't find an answer. Well, in 2007, the fluoride level in the public water supply in Ireland was reduced by 30%, and that very year, the paediatric admission rates reduced by 30% in Ireland. And it was the single most important public health measure taken that year in Ireland, and the age group that is most affected by it are infants, because they have the highest exposure to it. Yet nobody in the entire HSE or in the public sector who were investigating this were aware of the fact that the most widespread contaminant and exposure in terms of risk for the entire population was reduced by 30% that year. They didn't even see the association. And when I looked at, there's a report on heart disease in Ireland for 50 years by the Irish Heart Foundation. So they have data looking at mortality from heart disease from the 1950s up until 2010. And in that graph you see the mortalities for females and males increasing over the 1950s and 60s, and then in 1967 there's a big spike. There was a 50% increase in mortality for women for cardiovascular disease in 1968. The year after, Cork City and the other towns in Ireland were fluoridated, and nowhere in the report do they mention that that was the year that fluoridation rolled out beyond Dublin into the wider community in Ireland, and it continued to rise after that, but a 50% increase in mortality. And nobody again looked at the possible association between water fluoridation and mortality from cardiovascular disease.
And how does it affect the heart?
It affects the heart through multiple functions. One is it contributes to calcification of the arteries, so you're more inclined to get a stroke. So a paper published by a team of cardiovascular toxicologists this year in a journal looked at the effect of water fluoridation at the levels that are recommended by the WHO, and found that for people who were, say, diabetic, for example, it damaged their kidneys and caused calcification in their arteries, increasing their risk with regards to getting a stroke or cardiovascular disease. And they recommended as a conclusion in the end of it that mandatory fluoridation should stop. But nobody's reading these studies. That was published in a journal called Toxicology.
If you only had like a minute and a half of the best scientific evidence around the world on how bad and how toxic fluoride is for the human condition, can you give me your top 10?
Well, in Puerto Rico, which was the most fluoridated country in the world, it was actually the test case for the United States. They went in and fluoridated the water supply in the 1950s, and literally by the mid-50s, 75% of the population were fluoridated. They stopped in about 1984, and one set of data that I was looking at was mortality among women, because women are a high-risk group, especially as they get older, to fluoride's toxicity. They had a 60% reduction in mortality from respiratory disease for women the year after they stopped fluoridation in Puerto Rico. In the Basque region of Spain, they started fluoridation in 1988, and by 1990, the admission rates for asthma for children had increased by about 50–60%. In Ireland, I mentioned that cardiovascular disease deaths by mortality from cardiovascular disease increased by 50% in women within a year of fluoridation being rolled out around the country. In Mexico, when they introduced salt fluoridation, there was a fourfold increase in hospital admissions for asthma for children because of increased fluoride dietary increase. It affects the thyroid gland at extremely low levels. I mean, papers that were published in 2005, 2006 on populations that were exposed to fluoride with a mean level of 0.4 milligrams per litre, and even less, found that children drinking that water, that up to 50% of them had imbalances in their thyroid function, up to 50% of them. And that affects a whole range of disorders that could be complicated with regards to children. In that study as well, by a professor in India who's in the Indian the Indian Academy of Medicine, she also refers to the fact that fluoridation increases the risk of Down syndrome. So that was another study that was published in 1998 by an academic who looked at it and found that fluoridation particularly was dangerous for women under the age of 30, and he broke it up into different age groups and did statistical analysis on it, and found that for women under the age of 19, if they got pregnant, it increased the risk of having a Down syndrome child by 100%, and for women between the ages of 20 and 24 by 43%, and from 25 to 30 by 40%. And that's because it's actually mentioned in this report. They state in this report that fluoridation, that it's biologically plausible that fluoride can cause Down syndrome. So for the National Academy of Medicine in the United States to make that statement, and for us to continue to add fluoride to our water supply in Ireland when we have the highest rates of Down syndrome in the world, is not only illogical, it's criminal.
What are the links, Declan, that you know between fluoride and the brain?
The United States NRC report on fluoride that was published in 2006, they have a list of experts that worked on the document. One of them was a professor, Isaacson, and he's an editor of the Brain Journal, and is one of the leading physicians in the United States with regards to looking at the neurological effect of fluoride in the brain. He's published his own statement on the internet, which can be found, where he talks about the effect of fluoride on brain function, and he says you can't actually quantify the huge number of possibilities with how fluoride can impair brain function. The NRC themselves they have a section dealing with neurological behaviour in their report, and one of the things that they state at the end of the report on page 222 is this. It says fluorides also increase the production of free radicals in the brain through several different biological pathways. These changes have a bearing on the possibility that fluorides act to increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. That's just Alzheimer's disease. They also talk about in the report how it affects endocrine function and how it's likely to cause a decreased production of melatonin. So if you have probably the most at-risk group in the world regards to this are those who have high fluoride ingestion through dietary sources, and Ireland are the largest consumers of tea in the world, and the two recent risk assessments that have been undertaken by public health authorities in both Europe and in Asia, looking at the exposure of the population to fluoride from other sources besides fluoridated water, looked at tea consumption. One was in the UK and the other was in Taiwan, and in both cases they found that the majority of tea drinkers would be exposed to chronic levels of fluoride that would have a detrimental effect on their general health. And in both cases they tested, in England they tested 38 different brands of tea, and in Taiwan they tested in the region of 300 infusions of tea from different brands. And they used deionized water, so it had no fluoride in it, and both of them stated that if they did use fluoridated water, the levels would be even higher. So we, on average, in a study that was published in 2001 on nutrition that was undertaken for both north and south of Ireland, they found that the average person in Ireland drinks 4 cups of tea a day. Now, the European Food Safety Authority have said in 2006 that the average fluoride intake from a person living in a fluoridated area, if they drink just 2 cups of tea, and drinking water would be in the region of about 6 milligrams per day. So if the average person in Ireland is drinking 4 cups of tea, it's in the region of 10 milligrams per day. Now, the optimal level of fluoride that is recommended for total intake for a woman is 3 milligrams per day. So you have people in Ireland who are 3 times the optimal level that's supposed to be protective for dental caries. That just gives you an example as to how insane it is. So Ireland, in terms of the WHO, said in 1996, countries or individuals who have high dietary exposures to fluoride, they need to be examined with regards to their sensitivity to additional sources. No study was ever undertaken in Ireland before we commenced fluoridation. And the Food Safety Authority in Ireland published a report in 2011 where they looked at dietary exposures to fluoride in the Irish population, and it's amazing, I'm going to be presenting it later today. They determined, this is the risk assessment that has been undertaken to protect the public's health in Ireland. They tested one sample, one bag of tea from an unknown brand, and the sample was taken by an unknown individual working in the dental health college in University College Cork. And when I asked the Food Safety Authority to provide a chain of command, quality control and documentation to show what was the brand of tea, who took the sample, were there duplicate samples, was the reference on the box, the code documented, no data was available. So while in other jurisdictions in developed countries, when they do risk assessments, they don't just take a single tea bag, they test every brand of tea. They do it in duplicates or triplicates. In Ireland, we tested a single bag of tea, and based on that one single analysis, they said that the fluoride level in Irish tea was half what was in fluoridated water. So that's an impossibility, because if you're making tea with tap water, you're going to have twice the amount of fluoride that was present in this single tea bag. When you go and fill your kettle from a tap and you're using fluoridated water, when you boil it, it increases the concentration of fluoride, it doesn't decrease. And if you use that boiled water then to make something like, for instance, infant formula, you're further increasing the dose of fluoride that a child would be exposed to. Even within the highest authority in the United States, which is the National Academies of Medicine, 3 of the members of the 12 team of experts that looked at fluoridation, Professor Limebank, Dr. Treshan, who's a toxicologist, and Robert Isaacson, who's a neurobiologist, they've all come out publicly and stated that there's no safe level of fluoride exposure. And they went into it with an open mind. These are leading academics and researchers who've been researching the field of fluoride and other toxins for decades. Between them, they would have over 100 years of research experience. They're ignored. Their views are ignored by scientists, and the media won't even acknowledge the fact that these leading academics, the same with Professor Carlson in Sweden, and other academics right across Europe and in Japan and places like that, they ignore it. So even Professor Sheldon, who's a professor of public health in the University of Kent, he's published reports stating that fluoridation is an abomination and should stop, because of its effects in terms of supporting or being involved in contributing to chronic disease in the wider population. They're ignored. In Ireland, there is abject silence by professionals of public health in this country. They don't even want to talk about it. Now you have to ask, why is it that the medical and scientific community in Ireland are either ashamed or will completely avoid the topic of getting involved in a debate, or even just getting involved in doing an active examination of the potential risks? They don't want to know about it. So I was contacted by individuals in Israel recently. I had been in communication with them last year when Israel were considering the debate on water fluoridation, and I'd sent them some information supportive of their case. But recently the Minister for Health in Israel has been brought to court now. She's been sued with regards to stopping fluoridation. She stopped it on the grounds that she believes that, as Minister for Health, that it was harmful to women and children, and her view was supported by a professor of health in Israel who said that fluoridation was mass medication against informed consent and it shouldn't be tolerated. But I sent them information with regards to just 2 diseases as part of the case study of information that I'm working on. One was to do with asthma rates in Israel, how they increased within the Jewish community but not within the Arab community. And that's because the Israelis actually didn't fluoridate the Arab water supply. It was only the Jewish cities that were fluoridated in Israel principally, and only a very small percentage of Arabs that were actually living in Jewish cities. And it's documented in Israeli studies that are published that the Arab community basically did not have access to fluoridated water. So you had a dramatic increase in asthma in Israel since the 1980s. And the other one was to do with cancer rates, differences between Israel and all of the nations around it. The highest rates of leukemia in the world are found in Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, the United States. And in the Middle East, the highest rates of leukemia are found in Israel. They're way higher than any of the surrounding nations. And the same difference that exists in leukemia rates between Israel and Syria or Egypt or any of these countries is the same difference that exists between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And rates of leukemia have been increasing on average about 3% per annum only in the fluoridated countries. The main reason for this is that fluoride acts on osteoblast cells in human bone, and genetic mutations of osteoblasts are now regarded as the key factor in leukemia. So I presented them with the data from around the world showing that there was a cause and effect association between high rates of leukemia in Israel and other ones, thyroid cancers, a whole load of others, and fluoridation and asthma. And that is to support her case and present evidence showing a direct cause of harm from fluoridation among the population. I've also been working with communities in Kansas and in other locations in North America, in Canada, in New Zealand and in Australia, working with a doctor, Ryan in Australia, working with 3 doctors in New Zealand, working with a bunch of professors and doctors in Canada and in the United States. I'm like a spider's web, really, in many respects.
How does it make you feel being a scientist working on this campaign and people not believing what you're saying?
It can be very frustrating. Media outlets in Ireland, for example, like the Irish Times, they refer to scientists or opponents of water fluoridation as quack scientists, as unreliable, as conspiracy theorists, and lately the most remarkable one was folklorists. So they're trying to brush all scientists as basically quacks. So I'm starting my presentation today showing some of the leading academics, medical physicians around the world that have spoken out against fluoridation. The likes of Professor Carlson, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2000. He was responsible, along with a team of 6 other doctors in Sweden, for stopping fluoridation in Sweden. They completely destroyed the arguments that dentists were proposing with regards to fluoridation and showed that the science was completely bogus. Now, he is a professor of pharmacology and he knows about how fluoride affects the body, and he has said it's insane and that countries should be disgusted at the fact that they are actually mandatory forcing people for fluoridation to consume a drug that is harmful to them and the environment. Even within the highest authority in the United States, which is the National Academies of Medicine, 3 of the members of the 12 team of experts that looked at fluoridation, Professor Limebank, Dr. Treshin, who's a toxicologist, and Robert Isaacson, who's a neurobiologist, they've all come out publicly and stated that there's no safe level of fluoride exposure. And they went into it with an open mind. These are leading academics and researchers who've been researching the field of fluoride and other toxins for decades. Between them, they would have over 100 years of research experience. They're ignored, their views are ignored by scientists, and the media won't even acknowledge the fact that these leading academics, the same with Professor Carlson in Sweden and other academics right across Europe and in Japan and places like that, they ignore it. So even Professor Sheldon, who's a professor of public health in the University of Kent, he's published reports stating that fluoridation is an abomination and should stop, because of its effects in terms of supporting or being involved in contributing to chronic disease in the wider population. They're ignored. In Ireland, there is abject silence by professionals of public health in this country. They don't even want to talk about it. Now you have to ask, why is it that medical and scientific community in Ireland are either ashamed or will completely avoid the topic of getting involved in a debate, or even just getting involved in doing an active examination of the potential risks. They don't want to know about it.
What would you like to say to the Irish government?
I would like to say to the Irish government, when Enda Kenny was in opposition in 2000, Fine Gael made a commitment to end water fluoridation in Ireland if they got into government. And they did that based on the fact that they believed that it was contributing to chronic disease in Ireland. They have reneged on that promise. Now we have opposition parties in Ireland who are also demanding that water fluoridation should end. We are the last country in Europe and one of only 2 countries in the world that force all its citizens to drink a medicated water supply that they have not consented to. This is criminal behaviour and it needs to stop.